Hey everybody, welcome back to the Smattering, where we ask the important questions about investing. I'm Jason Hall, joined as usual by the voice of the people, my good friend, Jeff Santoro. Hey Jeff.
Hey, how are you, friend?
I'm good. I'm on the mend. For those that follow me on Twitter, they know I had knee surgery on Monday. For those that don't, I
So I
had
have a
knee
question
surgery on
for you
Monday.
about
Yeah,
your knee surgery. Did
yeah.
you have the surgery wearing your adult baseball uniform?
I did. It's a softball uniform. Yeah, I
I've
did.
been waiting until we were like recording the podcast to ask you about that.
That's good. That's good. That for it's funny talking about visuals is works so well on podcasts.
Well, this is a good plug for our Twitter accounts. You can follow Jason at the Smattering, and you can see a picture, a selfie of him smiling, holding crutches, wearing a softball uniform.
Yeah, you should follow us on Twitter. Even if you don't like want to engage on Twitter, don't engage. There's nothing wrong with a little lurking on the Twitter.
That's right.
No, it's fun. It's fun. We're starting the show off with a lot of banter and levity, Jeff, and I kind of feel like we're getting it out of the way now because this is kind of a heavy topic. The title of this episode, of course, what if you die?
Yeah, it's heavy. I think we'll work some humor into it because I think we're both the gallows humor type of person.
Yeah, very
But
much.
yeah, it's an important topic. I mean, you know, your surgery this week was certainly nothing that put your life at risk, but I think the whole idea of having surgery and that kind of a thing got us thinking about we've never talked about we talk about the ways we invest and what we think about, and we occasionally mention the fact that we have wives who are investing impacts, but we've never really talked about what happens if specifically you and I or someone listening who is the investor in the family or the person who's interested in or keeps track of the finances. You know, you have to plan for things you don't want to think about, and one of them is like, what if you pass away? What do you do next? Where does your spouse go? So that's what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, the thing that really kind of put this over the top, we've got one of the listeners of the podcast that I've gotten to be friendly with, whose name shall remain anonymous because of the nature of this thing. But he shared with me a recent diagnosis of a health condition that puts him at an extremely high risk, like 1 in 6, I believe, risk of a stroke before the age of 50. And this is somebody that's not even 40 yet and has a job that could potentially put them at higher risk factors. And now they have to be on blood thinner medications, which significantly increase the risk of bleeding to death. And it's one of those things that it's a reminder that, we read the actuarial data from the Social Security Administration, and it says, we know the average American is going to, and it carries over to most developed countries. The numbers are really similar, right? We have listeners all over the world, but the average American, the average male is going to live, you know, into their early 80s. The average woman in a developed country is going to live into their late 80s. And if you live to 65, you've got a very good chance of getting to 90, right? So the odds are in our favor that we're going to live long lives, right? And that we need to plan to pay for those long lives when we're no longer either able or interested in working to earn a wage. But the reality is, whether we're one of those people that has a health condition that increases our probability significantly, or the odds are still far in our favor, you have to take steps to prepare your family for if you're not gone.
And there's a piece of this that I don't think we're going to spend a lot of time on, but I think is worth mentioning right off the bat, which is, so we're in our 40s. So the average age that you just gave now that males in America live to is the early 80s. I'm hoping by the time you and I are that age, it's late 80s or early
Right.
90s.
Right.
And I'm hoping that our kids, it's even further than that. So, but a lot of the investing advice and rules of thumb that we all operate on are still sort of based on when people only maybe lived into their late 60s or early 70s. So there's a chance that someone listening right now who's in their 30s or 40s lives for 20, 25, 30, 35 years after retirement.
Right.
Whereas maybe a generation ago, you might only make it a decade after retirement. So that's not really the focus of this episode, but I think it's worth planting that thought in people's minds about, we talk a lot about goals and setting your goals and keeping your eye on those goals. I think that's an important one. Will you have enough money to live the life you want to live if you are lucky enough to be around for many decades after you retire?
Yeah, and the topic at hand, kind of circling back to the near term, because really it's what's the in the long term in the long term we're all dead. I think there's someone has said that, and thinking about long term returns and investing. So it's again, we know it's what happens when you die, but the focus of this show is what if you die now? What if you die tomorrow? It's the David Gardner snap test, Jeff, that you've talked about before, thinking about companies. If you snap your finger and the business is gone, what would be the implications? And it can give you an idea of the importance of the business and therefore some idea of its value as an investment, right? So the way I think about applying that same test to yourself and you snap your fingers, what are the implications? Who's affected? How are they affected? And what would you want to change about what that outcome would be? That's one of the ways I've really been thinking a lot about this.
Yeah, and it's not something that's fun to think about, but you have to. We're going to go in a bunch of different directions with this. The first thing I was thinking about, Jason, as I was mulling this over, is at the very basic level, I think like a step one thing that everyone can do today, right, is just make sure that their significant other, if they have one, or even if they don't, just someone else in their life can access their accounts, which is like a
Right.
very simple thing that I think a lot of people probably don't spend enough time thinking about. Does your spouse, significant other, whoever, just know the password to your brokerage account, to where your 401k is, that kind of stuff? So that's like a basic level thing that I think about right off the bat. Like, make sure the person that needs to know the information has a way to access it.
Yeah. Where are the assets? How do you get to them? So important. And I don't want to share a lot here, and I'm sure there's a lot of people listening that have similar experiences, but every family has a story about somebody that died, and either they're the people that counted on them being left in the lurch, or kids fighting over assets after the fact, or some sort of drama or misery that occurred. It seems like it's happened in every family at some point. And what I've come to learn is when you think about your assets, your whatever is left over when you're physically no longer here, and the people that depended on it, or the people that think they're owed a piece of it, is nothing's going to go as you thought it will once you're gone. Absolutely nothing's going to go as you thought it will if it's not in writing and it's not legally enforced and legally enforceable. Because the bottom line is that people that you think would behave one way will behave completely different when they think there is some significant source of wealth that they can get their hands on. It will absolutely tear families apart. And you have to think about that. You have to think about, what is the purpose of your wealth if you were gone, if you disappeared right this minute?
Yeah, and I think I don't I don't know that I agree with you that it'll happen in every situation, because there's probably plenty where it goes smoothly, but I think you should plan as if it's not going to go exactly the way you want, just because you don't know. I think I know you shared one story with me that we're not going to talk about here, but it was something that took people by surprise, the way a person acted. So I I agree with you that that's something that people should at least plan for. So we are absolutely not financial planners here, but I think I'm pretty comfortable saying, like, some of my first go-to kind of things to think about are like, make sure your spouse or significant other has access to your accounts, but also make sure there's some sort of will, revocable trust, whatever, that delineates where things go if you were to suddenly pass away.
Yeah, I think we're good about planning for those kind of temporary challenges. We talk about having the emergency savings and have pay the extra money to get long-term disability from your employer, like all the little things that we're good at doing. But I think the one thing that people have to think about in this situation is when you're gone, what can you line up to replace that is lost, and what can't you, right? You have a 6-year-old, and if I died, his father would be gone, right? That's irreplaceable. There's father figures in his life that could step in, and he's got a pretty amazing mom. But probably the biggest easy thing to replace, simplest thing to replace is income, you know? And the way I think about it, and I think the way most people should think about it, Jeff, is you're bridging the gap between the income that would disappear immediately or have some limited payoff. You know, most people have some sort of a policy from their employer where maybe it'll provide a year of income, or, you know, a year and a half of their income as a payout. But then when that's gone, it's gone, right? And then you still have 10 or 20 years of income that your family would be depending on before your spouse retired, before you would have reached retirement age, that you have to figure out some way to replace, right? And I think I still haven't completely wrapped my head around why so many people just don't bother to get something as simple as a term life insurance policy.
Yeah, and what you need depends on who's relying on your income.
Yeah.
So if you're 23 and single and you rent an apartment, the only life insurance you really need is like enough to bury you.
Right. Right. As morbid as it is to say it,
Yeah, I mean, that's
exactly
kind of
that.
all you need. Yeah,
Right.
and then once you're married or once you have
you want your
kids,
family to have to soak up the cost to put you in the ground, right?
right.
You don't, right? You don't.
But then obviously as your financial responsibilities increase as you go through life, and you know, if you get married or you have kids and there's people relying on your income, that's where you have to consider like a term life insurance policy, something like that.
Well, and it's a
Um,
catch-22, Jeff, because let's be honest, it's a lot easier and a lot cheaper to get term particular. And I think term makes sense for most people because, again, if you've started young building your wealth, by the time you're 60, 65, you should have established that retirement nest egg enough that you don't necessarily need to have the large amount of insurance, right? And if that term policy expires, you know, you've created invested wealth at that point to worry about it. But it's one of those things where it's like when it's cheapest, it's when you need it the least and you're least likely to get it. And for a lot of people, by the time you really think about it, well, guess what? You're into your 40s, maybe your cholesterol's up, you've put on some weight, maybe you've had a couple of knee surgeries. Sound familiar? Looking in a mirror right now. And things, it gets a lot more expensive when you get to that point, right? So that's one of the reasons I want to encourage people. Again, I don't know any of you people that well anyway, but I just want to encourage people to really think about exploring making sure you have that bridge of income in place. It's a lot cheaper than you think, I think.
it is. And this ties into what we talk about a lot on the podcast, which is mistakes you and I both made when we were younger, whether it was spending on dumb things or whether it was not really knowing enough about investing and not saving earlier enough. But this is one of those things that I think you can look back on. A lot of people could look back on and be like, I should have done that when I was 23, not when I was 53. So one thing that I was thinking about too, I want to get your thoughts on this. So there's so much advice out there, and we just gave our thoughts on it about needing some sort of insurance to replace your income. So let's just say someone who's listening right now is taking care of that. They have whatever they need, that if they go at any point, the money's not going to be an issue. But then there's a whole nother side of that doesn't get talked about enough, which is, so the people left behind with all that money, what do they do with it? Especially
Yeah.
if you're the person who knows exactly sort of like what the plan is. Like I'm going to buy this much in stocks and I'm going to keep this much in an index fund. And this is where my 401k is and all that kind of stuff. So what are your thoughts about a way to plan with your significant others so that, great, they have the money after you've unfortunately gone, but now they don't really know what to do with it?
Yeah, this is and I can use my own situation as a good example, and I think a lot of people, this is going to sound really, really familiar. And we've hinted at this before, and we've talked about this before. Is we're the ones that are really passionate about investing, right? We're the ones that are researching stocks. And by and large, most of the people listening to this, my guess is that your spouse probably has somewhere between 0 and 0.5% interest in doing the things that we do. And what happens is we kind of fall into inertia of having a conversation with our spouse about the things that are important for them to at least understand, right? We either want to talk about all of it, or we don't, or we just don't talk about any of it. And one of the things that we do, because my wife's not interested in studying individual stocks at all, but she understands how critically important it is for her to know where our assets are, where are we on our financial trajectory, and what to do if something happens. And so we talk through our finances about once a week. We just do a quick, where are we with our finances? Do we have any big spends that we need to make? And we're talking about our other rest of the stuff for the week too, kids schedules and plans and all that stuff. So we meet once a week and we spend 45 minutes going over stuff. And at least once a year, we have a pretty detailed conversation about where are our assets, taxable investing, where is our cash, what debts do we have, all of those things. So, and we manage a list that has accounts. Is it a 401k? Is it a Roth IRA? Whatever it is a savings account. Is it a taxable brokerage? Where is it? And how do I access it? So we have that conversation, like I said, at least once a year, to really make sure that my spouse knows, again, exactly what you're talking about, knows those things. That's a starting point, right? I think a lot of people like that do that, but that's as far as they go. And one of the things that we talk about a lot is the toolbox here. And I think we need to kind of build a toolbox for our spouse as well. It's like, in that worst case scenario, it's great to know where all of that stuff is, but it doesn't matter if they don't know what the hell to do with it, right? I've got 105 stocks spread across 6 accounts. The directions for my wife, and again, it's the difference between frameworks versus instructions. And some of these things, they just need to be clear instructions. And my instructions for my wife are, here is a certified financial planner, right? Here is somebody that is trustworthy, that we trust, that you can go to, that will help you liquidate 100% of these stocks and move these assets into index funds. So you no longer have to worry about managing stocks, and they can help you make decisions as you approach financial goals that normally I would have been making, about reducing exposure to stocks and moving more into bonds, freeing up cash to pay for the kids' college, like all of that stuff. You have a plan in place to replace that for your spouse, right?
Yeah, I'm thinking of like a similar plan would be like a really smart thing for kind of anyone. Like, step 1, here's the passwords. Step 2, here's all the accounts and what kind of thing they are, and like what this one's at Fidelity, this one's at Schwab, whatever, Bank of America, just so they know where to go. And then I like your idea of go call this person, or we've mentioned a couple episodes ago, there are a couple resources we've put in previous show notes of fee only financial advisors. So like someone you're going to pay just a one-time fee to look over your stuff. If you know a person who's a professional, great. But if you don't, here's 2 networks, connect with someone and they can guide you the rest of the way. Even if it's as simple as liquidating all the stocks and just putting it into an index fund.
Right.
Because what you don't, I shouldn't say what you don't want. What I wouldn't want personally is for my wife to like not know where to go and then just find a financial planner who like works on a percentage of the portfolio or some percentage of the investments under management. And then all of a sudden she's 65, 70, whatever, and looking
She
back
ends
at
up with a salesperson and not an
right.
actual
Yeah.
fiduciary,
Yeah.
right? That
So at the
has an
very least,
obligation.
like point them in the direction of like who to connect with, like kind of like
Yeah.
you were saying.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really important. But like a big part of it for me too. So like there's the tactical stuff like that. It's like make sure that they're prepared to act responsibly, because I mean, let's be honest, you died, the last thing your partner needs is the additional stress of figuring out your shit and your portfolio and finding the money and figuring out how to pay the bills while trying to figure out how to get you buried in the ground and plan us like all there's enough stress out there. You know what people want? They want instructions. They want something that they can just go do and they have somebody work with and not have to think about it and figure it out, right? And I think that's just so important. So you want to set just it's like setting people up for success, right? You don't want them to have to worry about it. And I just think that's a big thing.
One thing that what you just said made me think about is consider what automated things are in place that you're aware of that you would want your significant other to know if a month goes by before they even can get around to worrying about this. So, like, I'll use myself as an example. The only recurring things I have going on are paycheck contributions to my 403b, which would obviously stop if I was not working, and the little bit of money that comes out of my checking account every month that goes into my brokerage account to buy stocks with. And honestly, if that kept going for a month, it would just sit in cash. It doesn't get automatically allocated to anything. And I'm not saying I would cancel those things, but that would be part of my instruction sheet, so to speak. So that, like, because what you just said about like the people who are grieving when you pass are going to be the people who that they're not going to worry about your retirement account for the first couple weeks or month or whatever. Like, there's enough other stuff to worry about. So I think if you have any sort of like if I had any sort of like weird, complicated like things that would just keep happening automatically, that's something I think is worth making sure the person who's going to deal with it knows about.
Yeah, and I think it's useful too if you can. And this is a challenge because a lot of times what happens is people have a will and then the executor of the will, a lot of times it ends up being their spouse, right? Or one of their children, adult children. And in a lot of cases that's perfectly fine, right? It's a simple set of assets. There's not a lot to deal with. But that's not always the case. Particularly if somebody maybe has young children, they're trying to work at the same time. So maybe if you have, and again, maybe it's the CFP can recommend somebody that you can have work as an executor. Maybe you have a good attorney that you trust for not a lot of money can help manage those things. But again, things that can, again, to your point, it's kind of a version of automating, those decision making processes just to make it as easy as possible to remove those stressors from the lives of the people that you've left behind. I think it's important too to start thinking about one thing that I've learned in our situation as life has become more complex is things like using a revocable trust to avoid having assets getting tied up in probate, because sometimes if you have assets that maybe your family might kind of need sooner rather than later, the probate process can take months to years to play out. And using something like a revocable trust that owns your assets and then you and your spouse control the trust can really reduce some of that stress and make it easier to get assets and to liquidate assets quickly. So little things like that. And again, I think this is one of the things where sometimes we just have to pay a pro to do it. And the more you put it off, the harder it is to do it and the less likely you are to do it.
The other thing I'll say too is I kind of already knew this just because of the way I taught myself about investing when I first got into it a couple of years ago. But just in preparing for this episode, there's a lot of like really easy to digest and reliable information about a lot of the stuff we're talking about on just commonly used investing websites. So like if you Google some of these as questions, you'll get like Investopedia articles or other reputable sites like NerdWallet that do pretty good financial articles that are easy to read. Not advice, obviously, but can tell you like so. For example, recently we inherited some stock from my wife's grandmother, and I was trying to like get a solid answer on how do you figure out the cost basis when you inherit shares. And I found
And
several
and Jason and
articles,
Jason was wrong.
and you were wrong.
Jason
So
was wrong.
I found several articles that confirm that it is the cost base. In most cases, there are some loopholes, so read the articles. But in 90 something percent of the cases, it resets on the day of the person's death, as long as they're inherited to you and not gifted to you ahead of time. But a lot of these topics we're talking about can be found pretty easily with an internet search and the read from a bunch of sources, but you'll see that a lot of them confirm each other, and that can give you a pretty good direction to head in.
So, Jeff, I have a question, and I don't want this to get too personal, so maybe be maybe more theoretical about this. But what do you think is the biggest roadblock for people not taking steps sooner on this sort of thing?
I think it's the same reason no one ever changes their checking account. You know what I mean? I use Bank of America, and I make no interest basically, and I know I could just pretty easily switch everything to like an online bank and get 4%, and I just don't, because it's a pain in the ass. So, like, I think that's part of it. I think part of it's everyone has a different relationship with thinking about death. Some people are completely terrified about it and don't want to think about it at all. And some people, it doesn't bother them. I think that's a big part of it. And let's be honest, what 20 something year old, at least one who's in good health, actually thinks about, oh, I could die tomorrow? Like, you can, but no one, it's just one of those things. Like, I think about it more at this age than I did 5 years ago, than I did 5 years before that, than I did 5 years before that. I think is probably for most people a combination of all those things. It's also just not, it's not like, still isn't as easy as it probably should be. Like, even knowing where to go to like shop around or what you should look for, the conversations I've had about it with a professional have been with someone trying to sell me something years ago. The person who was working with me on my retirement account was like, oh, we also have life insurance. And he was a little bit pushy about it. So I ignored him and then didn't get life insurance in that moment. So I think that's part of it. I think there could probably be, it could be easier to do some of these things. And then when it comes to like just talking to your significant other about it, I think it's hard when you're the only person who like is really into the investing stuff. So, or if you're just the person who's always paid the bills, right? Like, I'm the bill payer in my family, and my wife jokes with me all the time, like, if you die, I'm not going to know how to do anything. And I'm like, you'll be fine. Here's where everything is. But I think it's a lot of those things. I think it's all those, for it's probably a little bit of that for everyone, and then the percentages of how much of those things impacts each person probably depends on their personality. What do you think? Do you think I'm missing anything?
Yeah, no, I guess that's it. But I think there's just the inertia too, right? It's we and like I think one of the other things that gets kind of the mentality of it that you were talking about is people whenever they have people like do these visual like representations of what they think like their wealth growth is going to be, it's like on this smooth like linear curve higher, and it's really like up down up down up down, right? The boom bust cycle of the stock market and asset values and all that stuff that we go through. I guess we're really hard at imagining these sorts of scenarios, and fear does come into play.
I think another thing too is, and again, look, there's exceptions to all of this. Like, I know people who've had to deal with ill parents and have tragic situations when they are younger, and that probably makes you grow up a little bit quicker.
Yeah.
But if you take like just the typical 20 something year old person, their parents are what, in their 50s? So there's usually not, in most cases, significant health issues. You're not thinking about retirement homes and, parents who maybe can't live alone. Fast forward to people our age and now your parents are in their 70s, maybe even pushing 80. And now all of a sudden you're seeing maybe some of the lack of planning from your own parents' generation, because now you're picking up the slack, right? And then it's like, oh, I better get my act together so that I don't do this to my kids. But by that point, now you're in your 40s or 50s. So I think that might be part of it too. Like, why people do it later is probably because they're seeing how crappy it is to be like the helper, and they like, oh, maybe I should take care of this for myself. I came across some of this stuff later too for that exact reason. Like, it didn't happen in my family, but like I have friends and people I work with who have older parents, and yeah, hey, how's your mom doing? Oh, geez, now I'm dealing with this. So you start to think like, oh, I need to plan for those things myself.
Yeah. I want to say a couple things that might be kind of blunt, but I'm hoping maybe they'll resonate with somebody out there in a positive way. But if you're one of those people that you get squeamish thinking about death, and it's just scary and you're nervous and anxious about it and you're afraid to, what's even worse than that? Leaving your family without any income if you die. I mean, that's a pretty shitty move. So I know that's blunt and not very nice to say, but it absolutely terrifies me, Jeff, the thought that if something happened to me, that my wife would be left picking up the pieces with a young child. And, after, a quarter century of building a life together and joy and great memories, that I could only imagine a certain sense of bitterness and frustration that is going to come up. And I wouldn't want to leave my family dealing with that. So sorry if I'm offending anybody for that, but
No, I mean, you're not wrong. I think it's worth pointing out that regardless of your advanced planning, your wife will be stuck with your terrible stock picks. But that's a whole separate
touche,
conversation.
touche. Well, next decade's up 41% today. So
That's a
my
that's a good thing to say on this podcast where we talk about the long term. Here's what happened today
right, right, here's the one that went up 40% in one day.
in one day.
But no, it's true. And again, that's why I have a person for her to fix that flaw. But let's kind of put a maybe kind of summarize this. Maybe just kind of again our general thoughts about, based on our experiences, what we've seen, just kind of how to start eating this elephant.
So again, with all the caveats that we are not certified financial planners, I think we're in agreement in terms of like what we agree is smart for our own lives. Your significant other should have access to your accounts, or at least know where access can be found. You need to have some sort of will, revocable trust, something in writing that's legally binding that says, here's who is supposed to deal with all of this. And by the way, that's something that sometimes you need to revisit, because you might make a
We
will.
look at it every year, Jeff. Yeah, I think you
Yeah.
have to look at it
But I
every
think
year.
the whole thing about inertia, I know of people who I'm like, we'll talk, oh, yeah, I have a will. I did it when I was like 25. Well, go back and look, because you might have listed like your parents as the person to like take custody of your children, but now they're 25 years older.
Right.
And maybe
Right.
now that's not the appropriate place. So, like, something to revisit. So, I say those things. And then I think having some sort of life insurance situation set up that can cover your income, at least to bridge the gap, like you said, until maybe the expenses aren't what they, maybe you wait till your kids are out of the house, or till your wife or husband is at retirement age and they can figure it out on their own from there. And then some sort of written instructions. Here's what to do. Here's the super important thing. Here's what can wait. Here's who to call. And that can be as simple as like a Google Doc, if that's how your family operates, that you share, and or a Word document or something you print and put in a safe, whatever works for you. And then so the person knows, like, if God forbid something happens, here's where you go. Like, that's, to me, that's the recap in terms of like what I think you and I either do or want to do or plan to do. But I think those are the basics.
Yeah, and I'm going to say something I said earlier because I think it's really important. If you want certain things to happen with your assets, you have to be specific, and they need to be specific in your will or in the instructions for the trust, if that it's assets that are owned by a trust, and it has to be legally enforceable, right? And you need to talk to the people that are affected. They need to be aware, right? Don't let people assume certain things, because that happens all the time, and it's those messed up expectations. That's what leads to acrimony, right? So think about like the outcome that you would want to have. and try to do everything you can to influence with very specific instructions so that the people that are managing your assets, they know what to do, and that it's very clear and unambiguous for the people who are on the other side who are receiving those assets. I think another thing, Jeff, that's important is like at some point, particularly if you've managed to establish a certain amount of substantial wealth, you kind of have to be willing to let go a little bit too, right? You don't want to be telling your kids how to live their life after you're dead, right? Or what to do with what used to be your money, but it's now their money, right? And the same thing with your spouse too. Obviously, you want to make sure they know where to get it and they have the tools, right? If they're in your situation, Jeff, I have 100% confidence that your wife would be very, very quick on the uptake to figure out how to pay the cable bill. Smart lady, right? But if you have a spouse that's never had to deal with that, make sure they have the tools to manage the financial side of the house, right? But not, you don't want to still be meddling after you're gone, right?
Yeah, like if you leave instructions, they should not, like if I leave instructions, they're not going to be every Wednesday you need to take the money that's in the brokerage account and buy the stock you have the highest conviction. Like that's not going to fly.
Right,
Um,
right.
it would probably be something like you said, like sell all of this and buy VOO, the ETF that tracks the S&P 500, right?
Right.
Something very, and then just contribute to it for the next 30 years and leave it alone. Like something very simple.
Right. Or
But
call Bob. Here's his phone
yeah,
number.
right. Call this person. And
Yeah.
so, all right, I think we said what we want to say about this. So why don't we take a quick break here, and then we'll come back with something a little lighter. We're gonna talk about all the news lately about cryptocurrency and crypto exchanges and the SEC suing them, and we're gonna nerd out.
Speaking of early deaths,
Yeah, we're gonna we're gonna nerd out a little bit on the potential early death of some cryptocurrencies. So stick around and we'll be right back.
hey Jeff. So we're calling this segment "Signal or Noise."
Yeah, signal or noise, the SEC is suing crypto exchanges. So I'll give like a quick 30-second opening here, and then you can take it in any direction you want. So if you follow the news lately, there's been a couple SEC actions against Binance and Coinbase, which are two crypto exchanges. One publicly traded and on the surface, at least, a little bit more legitimate in terms of what they report and how upfront and transparent they are. One a little bit less so.
Yeah, and Binance is the biggest in the world, right? And
Correct.
yeah, yeah.
And without getting too deep into the weeds here, because this is something I'm still learning and sort of wrapping my brain around, but essentially the SEC is arguing that these trading platforms are illegal security exchanges.
Unregulated securities exchanges.
Correct.
Right.
And there's all these very specific things that the SEC uses to determine if something is a security, like a stock is a security, for an example. We don't need to really get into that too much. But that's basically the crux of the argument, is that if Coinbase, just to use them as an example, trades cryptocurrencies and the SEC determines that these cryptocurrencies are securities, Coinbase needs to file as a security exchange, and they have not, and or cannot, and or aren't allowed to. Like that's where it gets a little murky. So my question, the question, what's the signal, what's the noise here, is if you are a investor and you're interested in cryptocurrency, and we're going to get a little bit into like not all cryptos are created equal in this issue, but what do you do? Because this could go two different ways. This could go, these exchanges get shut down, at least in the US, and now hundreds, thousands of crypto
Partly
coins are
shut
not,
down. Partly shut down.
partly shut down because, as we'll talk about, like Bitcoin is already pretty much not, has been deemed not a security.
Right. There's already regulators on the commodities side, right?
Right. Yeah.
Are already doing some regulation here.
So it could go that direction, or they could figure something out and it goes the different direction. But, it's a pretty big thing if you're someone who's been following this space. So that's sort of some ground ground level information there. So what are you thinking? What's signal? What's noise? What should investors be thinking about?
So this is I'm sure anybody that's followed this is familiar with the Howey test, right? Which is this is the test. I think there's 4 parts to the Howey test. That basically this is like to determine if something is a security. I'm not going to get into the specifics of it. Google can tell you everything you need to know, and you don't have to hear me and Jeff blathering on about this. Go ahead, Jeff.
Well, so real quick, because we can say them very quickly and then you can Google it and read in detail.
Yeah.
The 4 things are: there's an investment of money in a common enterprise with the expectation of profit to be derived from the effort of others.
Right. Right. So thinking about the crypto universe broadly, there are and Coinbase's CEO has talked a lot about this because they've said that they've rejected something like 90+% of tokens and currencies that have applied to be traded on their platform that are clearly securities, right? That you check the box off on multiple of those. I think it's maybe 3 of the 4, and they say it's a security. I can't remember exactly what it is, but so they say that we're already being pretty rigorous about keeping securities off of our platform. And I've been thinking a lot about this because I think the reality is that there are a lot of crypto assets that are clearly securities. Somebody or some bodies created them, right, with the idea, and they're being sold, and people are buying them with the idea that they're going to make a profit based on what other people are doing, right? So you have the people that have created these tokens that are claiming they're building something on it. And a lot of them are absolute garbage, right? We've seen so much, the grifters, right, have come through and made so much money as the bubble for crypto skyrocketed, what's obviously was a bubble now. And you look at something like Dogecoin as an example. It was actually built as a joke. Like they made it as a joke. And it has a market value of somewhere between $6 and $8 billion. I haven't looked at it in a day, which means it could be just about anywhere. So you have, it's a multi-billion-dollar joke at this point, and all Elon Musk has to do is tweet about it, and the value can skyrocket or fall depending on how the context of what he tweets is taken. And I think in the long run, whatever happens with these lawsuits is going to lead to a healthier environment for crypto, because it's going to make it harder for the scammy garbage to even exist in the market, right? The things that aren't real, that's going to be harder for them to exist. And it's going to provide clarity, which, let's be honest, the SEC has been horrible about providing clarity to the markets about these different asset types. Like what are they? And if I'm an investor, if I'm a tech investor, if I'm a developer and I need access to capital, it's just really hard to get access to capital to build anything on blockchain right now, because there's so much of an overhang from this right now. So I think from that perspective, it is a massive amount of signal. I think maybe the noise side is that this is going to kill crypto.
But I want to pause on that for a second. So just full disclosure, because I am not an expert on this. You have a better grasp on it and have thought more about it than I do. But I've thought a lot about it recently because I've become a big fan of Matt Levine's newsletter, which is a daily newsletter out of Bloomberg that Matt Levine writes.
Money
And
stuff. It's wonderful.
Money stuff. Thank you. I couldn't remember the name of it. And he's written about this a lot just in the past couple of weeks. So I've been thinking a lot about it, and it's taught me a lot. He's a good writer and he's entertaining and he's thought provoking, but also gives enough background to wrap your head around it. And I don't know, he hasn't said this, but one of the things I've wondered is like the scenario you just gave where the result of all this, even if it takes years, could be that crypto is healthier. The crypto economy, so to speak, is healthier at the end of it because you can keep the grifters out and now they're regulated, and it's almost it could theoretically be as rigorous as stock investing is in terms of keeping the grift out. Yeah. But I don't know. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that it goes the complete other direction. and they just say these can't be registered as securities. Maybe there's too many right now to even do that, and they just shut them down. So I get where you're coming from. Like, that's the noise part of it. And it is interesting. And this is something Matt Levine has mentioned. Like, the reason this is happening now is because the market's down and people are losing money, and they didn't say a word when it was going up and everyone was making money.
Right.
But if it stays down long enough and there's enough, momentum behind the move to regulate or to shut down, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that they shut these exchanges down. Now, does that kill crypto entirely? I don't know, maybe not, but
Yeah.
it would deal a pretty severe blow to these thousands of cryptocurrencies that millions of investors probably own little pieces of.
I think most of them should die. Not the investors, the crypto assets. Let me be
Thank
clear.
you for clarifying, especially
Yeah.
on our episode about what if you die.
Right. Right. Well, it felt necessary on this episode, but no, I
Yeah.
really do. Most of those assets should die because they're garbage and they're not legitimate and they don't have any technical advantages to be able to build stuff for like to run transactions on. Right. And I think that's really important. So, I mean, I think this is something that a lot of people in the crypto community have argued for a long time, is that as much as the idea of these trading platforms has helped bring crypto into like the public consciousness because now it's accessible, they don't really need to exist for like the core of what crypto was originally built for to do. Because that you go back to Bitcoin, the creation of Bitcoin was the idea largely to serve as a store of value in a currency, right? To be able to buy things with it, not to trade it on an exchange, to be able to hang on to it as a store of value that would appreciate in value, but not to trade it, right? Trading it on some third party exchange was never part of it. Like you would physically possess it on a storage device or on your computer, right? And you could send portions of it to pay for things, right? So it's kind of like the platforms in a way that kind of bastardized the core of what crypto was really developed for, to be decentralized. So now you've got these centralized trading platforms, and so now instead of central banks and fiat money, you have Coinbase and you have the goodness, what's the other one?
The
Binance,
other
right?
Binance, yeah.
Binance. You have which so it's almost like just like it's like the so again, I think the crypto industry will tell you that let them die on the vine, let them go away, let the regulation blow that up, and crypto is going to be healthier because now we can actually build the tools, and that signal or noise, it's for the moneyed investors who are actually looking to fund these things. Now they don't have to figure out what's garbage versus what's real. It's going to be a lot easier, right? So,
Well,
so
let me
there's
ask
that.
you.
Is this? Go ahead.
I want to ask this question because this is the piece of the crypto universe that I still don't have my head wrapped around. So let's say you are a crypto blockchain or a blockchain developer, and you're trying to make a product, you're trying to build something that will do smart contracts. And I use smart contracts as my example because you and I have talked about it before. And I think it's a really easy way for like the new person to wrap their head around the power of blockchain technology, which is
Mm-hmm.
essentially you and I agree to a contract. It's in the blockchain. When X happens, it executes. The person who is getting whatever gets it, and it's over with, right? There's no
Right.
intermediary, there's no fee you're paying. It's done.
Right.
So let's say you're building that, and do you need a token or a coin to go along with it? Like, do I need to buy JSON coin in order for your blockchain based smart contract thing to get off the ground? Or is it sort of like an extra piece that isn't necessarily vital to the development of the product you're trying to build?
It depends on the blockchain you're building on, partly, right? So a lot of the tokens that are out there actually live on Ethereum's blockchain, even though they're not Ether. So like those tokens, like the things are happening on the Ethereum blockchain, but the token that would be trading hands as part of how that transaction is happening is something else, right? But generally, yes. But again, the idea is to move these. You have to get to a point where you don't have this extreme volatility in the asset itself, right? In the Bitcoin or whatever it is, It has to have a stable, predictable value. In other words, if we're using, say, Bitcoin's blockchain to for chain of custody for a piece of real estate, and the deal takes 2 months to go by, and you agreed at this price, in 2 months, the volatility of Bitcoin could make a significant difference in the amount of Bitcoin that's going to be traded hands, right? So, but still, it would still use that mechanism. You would use Bitcoin as the mechanism, right? The payment mechanism to do it, because in the smart contract, it is Bitcoin that is the payment method, right? So again, you have to get to a certain level of predictability with the value of these assets. But there's an easy answer to that. The smart contract, the value is in US dollars. And when the transaction happens, it's whatever amount of crypto asset equals that agreed upon amount. That's what transacts, right? So there's ways that you can work. But again, the key to it is, I think one of the things that's complicated the idea of crypto so much is people think about going to buy a t-shirt and pay with Polkadot or Cardano. And how am I going to remember? What about how much is it in Ether? How much? Like, no, that's not how it's going to work. It's going to be just like you pull out a Visa or a MasterCard or American Express. At some point, the way that we're paying, we're still going to think about it in dollars or euros or whatever it is. That's our predictable, like, base currency, right? That whatever that is going to be the same. And we're not going to have to be thinking about doing stupid math in our heads, but it's the underlying mechanisms that are more secure, they're more reliable, they move the intermediaries out of the middle that cost money, that don't provide value for that cost, right? All of that stuff, I think all of that potential is still very much there for crypto. We just got so caught up in trying to chase trading virtual beanie babies, right, on these platforms, that it's created this massive amount of noise.
Yeah, and that's the thing that I can't, and I've argued this with other people who are big crypto believers. Like, I believe it will become centralized, and I believe it will become profitized by big companies. Like the
Yeah.
idea that it's going to kill Visa and MasterCard, I still don't buy. I think Visa and MasterCard are just going to figure out a way to let people transact using blockchain and so they can take a fee. But maybe I'm a cynic.
Yeah, no, I think there's some truth to that. But again, I think that the idea is that there's massive pricing cost advantages that it can erode these oligopolies like that. It can erode their moats. And as
Yeah.
much as Visa and MasterCard may still have a role to play, and I think you're probably right, when if a technology can get in the back door that, for example, you operate like one of those little bodegas, or you own a 7-Eleven or whatever it is, a little retail store, you're getting 4 or 5% operating margin. You own a restaurant, you're getting 2 or 3 or 4% operating margin, right?
Right.
You make such a tiny amount of money, and the transaction fees that you pay for your payment processors are probably equal to your margins, right? Your net margins at the end of the day.
Right. So if you're able to sell your coffee at your stand and not pay those fees, your margins just doubled.
Yeah, even if you cut the fees down by 25%, you increased your profits by 30%, right? I mean, it's a substantial amount of upside for these businesses. Plus the velocity of money, something a lot of these businesses deal with is, it's not a McDonald's that has hundreds of billions and billions of dollars on its balance sheet, or a Starbucks, or one of these, the retail coffee, the coffee shop, the local coffee shop owner. If he has 2 months of payroll in his bank account, he has 1 month more payroll than his competitors do, right? They don't keep cash. So something else that blockchain can change is the velocity of money. That transaction happens, they get the money in seconds. Like,
Yeah.
and so those sorts of potentials are enormous. When we can, the key though is getting beyond this perception and the reality at this point that you're paying for things in stupid token or smart token or whatever it is, right? But you're just paying in dollars, and it's happening on the blockchain, and it's happening in a way that drives out costs, increases velocity, and means more of your money goes to the person that you're paying, right?
All right. So reckless prediction time. What do you think happens with, let's just use Coinbase as the example, since that's the publicly traded company. What do you think happens with this lawsuit?
This is hard. I think here's your two outcomes. The least likely is some sort of a settlement. The SEC seems pretty clear. I mean, this is going back to 2017, really, since they've been telegraphing their view on this, and it seems pretty clear the SEC has no intention of settling. They want to take these things. They want to get, they're going to court, right? The courts are making the decisions here, right? So I think most likely this is going to go to the Supreme Court. And dude, I don't know what's I don't know what's going to happen in the Supreme Court with this, but I would be very surprised if if these cases don't end up before the Supreme Court, or at least one, and then that would potentially influence a lower court decision if there's a precedent at the Supreme Court. But I do think maybe the SEC is going to be forced to provide a path to let these operate as regulated securities exchanges if the courts rule that these are indeed securities and the public market has demand for them. Then the government's role is to regulate it, right, as per the law. And there has to be a path for these exchanges to be able to operate as securities exchanges if that's what they want to do. With that said, Jeff, Coinbase has spent a ton of money and made it a major priority to build their kind of AWS for crypto, which is basically providing like the centralized cloud-based tools for people to build blockchain and to build blockchain tools on, right? And have a place to run those things. And I think that that's potentially at some point, that's going to be a bigger part of Coinbase's long-term business. But man, they really need those trading fees to pay for all that.
Yeah, I don't have a good feeling on like how it shakes out. I just from the little bit I've read, I kind of agree with you that it doesn't seem like they want to settle, but it would be a pretty big deal if they just ended up shutting down like an entire crypto exchange that is a publicly traded company that was allowed to come public and has been public for years,
So this is last words on this. This is I would say this is probably 90% of the reason I decided to sell Coinbase a few months ago. Is it became more and more clear to me that it was going to be, the regulatory environment was not going to get more clear. There was substantial risk, and it just became kind of the too hard part. I still own Bitcoin, Ethereum, and so a little bit of Solana, because I do think that like the underlying technologies are still going to be valuable and eventually maybe even more pervasive, not visible, but pervasive in terms of like the back end technologies. But it's just going to be, it's harder and harder to project, like for a business like Coinbase, what's it going to look like in 5 years? So I'm going to sit on the sidelines for now. Okay, Jeff, we did it again, buddy.
We did it. We said words
about things, words about things. All right, friends, as always, just a reminder, we like to ask these hard questions about investing, about life, even about death in this case. But it's up to you to figure out your answers to those questions. More than ever, I believe in each and every one of you. You can do it. You can figure out the right answers. All right, Jeff, we'll see you next time.
See you next time.